Hello, everybody. This is Deanna Minnick. Welcome to the Detox Summit. Today, I have a very special guest. In fact, I would say that he is the father of oral chelation therapy, which is why I definitely wanted to have him as part of all of our informational and inspirational leaders as part of the summit. Dr. Garry Gordon received his Doctor of Osteopathy in 1958 from the Chicago College of Osteopathy in Illinois. He also obtained his honorary medical degree from the University of California at Irvine in 1962 and completed his radiology residency from Mount Zion in San Francisco, California in 1964. He has a number of different specialties that he can really go deep into providing us information with. But again, I would say that what we would really like to hear from him is more on oral chelation therapy. So welcome, Dr. Gordon, to the Detox Summit.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure to be with you.
So lovely to have you. Perhaps, Dr. Gordon, you can tell us a bit about your own personal journey and how you became the father of oral chelation therapy. How does one that has so many different medical degrees, an MD, a DO, and an honorary MD, does somebody that goes through this traditional training come into something like oral chelation?
Well, that's a great question because since intravenous chelation dramatically changed my life, so demonstrably so that I wound up having to form the American College for the Advancement in Medicine and formalize the necessary training and knowledge to take chelation to the rest of the world because I had been born sick. I had many problems from a total achlorhydria to a severe heart block. So in medical school, I couldn't go up a flight of steps without getting into heart failure. And as you get into the big picture, my health was a mess. But after the 8th intravenous chelation, it was as though I had stepped into a phone booth and put on my Superman cape. And it was that much of a change. But in that year, that's going back over 40 years now, in that year, when I got suddenly well because I had been disabled with angina by age 29, I couldn't go from room to room, had to close my medical. So with that dramatic thing, I had to figure out what's going on. So I wound up hitting the libraries. And as the good Lord had it, we wound up actually finding the first book was Metal Binding in Medicine by Dr. Seven, and it was published by Lippincott, and it gave you the whole story of the first meeting on chelation. And everything was very positive.
And so so at age 29, how did you actually stumble upon somebody to do the IV chelation for you? How did you even think to create that path?
Well, what happened is actually a colleague of mine, a Carlos Lamar in Florida, was an endocrinologist, and he was one of the first ones to ever use EDTA outside of the more narrow confines. Herta Spencer was the first one ever to really treat hypercalcemia. But Dr. Carlos Lamar was an endocrinologist, and it was a crazy story. A lady who had significant pathologic calcification of her aorta, and he wound up using chelation and saw that he was able to reverse that and bring this person back. And then subsequently another colleague, Dr. Ray Evers, really started popularizing it. But as I got into it, a Dr. Alslaben in Los Angeles wound up treating a lot of people, but he was going to charge you $1 million to tell you how to do chelation. So I decided that wasn't very professional. So I went ahead and studied it, put together the course, and would have never charged anyone a cent for how to do chelation. But as I got into the picture deeper and deeper, and those days, we didn't dream that lead had anything to do with disabling heart disease. Now, after these 40 years since I formed the American College for Advancement in Medicine, we now even have the American Heart Association's journal called Circulation, having articles like Lead Unmasked as Silent Killer. And we have top people at Harvard Medical School doing the incredible research proving that the relative risk factor of bone lead on your health is 8.8. There is no other risk factor in medicine that comes near what I just said. In other words, we now can prove that the level of lead in your bones, which only Harvard has the ability to non-invasively tell you the level of lead in your patella, your knee bone, we published it in the journal, the AMA. In the article is bone lead and cataracts, and then they went ahead and developed that when you're higher your bone lead, the sooner you die of heart disease. And now we have even the archives of internal medicine publishing papers that all causes of morbidity and mortality tie to how low you keep your lead throughout life. So as we get into the big picture, as I ran the American College for Advancement in Medicine and was program chairman, one of my speakers was Claire Patterson, and he's the director of the California Institute of Technology, and he had researched when did lead start to poison man. So he really drilled the ice core, Arctic and Antarctic, and published papers and led to the recognition that it was the industrial age that changed the level of lead in man. And then he started doing bone lead studies around the world and found that from 700 years ago till now, the average level of lead in bones of everyone on the planet has gone up between 1,000 and 2,000 times. And since I've been really dealing with this issue and have become deeply involved in trace element metabolism, and I ran a laboratory called Mineral Lab with offices in Asia as well as in Europe and America, later was taken over by Doctors Data, but I have really studied trace elements extensively because it became clear that we want to know how much lead is in us. But it turns out that blood lead and provoked urine, et cetera, are really only showing you what we call readily chelatable soft tissue stores. Bone lead is really only measurable with very sophisticated radioactive sources of lead, so it's as painless as bone density, but the equipment is not available excepting basically at Harvard, and I think Johns Hopkins is thinking of getting into it. So now we have data that prove that the level of lead in your bone is really going to determine how long you get to live, and you're 1,000 times what you were meant to be before we started perturbing the surface of the earth with the industrial age. And now that we burn so much coal, we're even afraid to eat fish because there's so much mercury and lead and cadmium coming out of the burning of coal. So then the question becomes, we've done over millions of people have been chelated, and we had the trial to assess chelation therapy published in JAMA this past year, and it only took $31 million to get that data, which is so persuasive. If one looks at the data, one would want everybody you love to be chelated because, for example, diabetics had actually a 51% overall reduction in mortality simply by getting the lead out. But we didn't know that, did we? And when my chest pain went away, I assumed that we had some kind of rotor-rooter effect and that I had found liquid Drano and all my arteries were magically clean. And yes, in some people, there is a deplaquing and clearly a beneficial effect, but there's a more profound effect, and that is the energy production in your mitochondria, where the lead levels intracellularly are interfering with the electron transport chain, and that's where unhealth starts. In cells even can go in finally into cancer, become anaerobic. So when we look at the picture, it turns out that as much as I love IV chelation, and I'm so glad that we got the $31 million from NIH, and I'm so happy that I was just this weekend with Dr. Gervasio Lamas, head of the Miami Heart Institute, who was the principal investigator on the $31 million. And now that it's been published, and all of the major people that want to keep selling bypass and want to keep selling stents and keep on praying that statins are the answer, they hate this data because this data shows that they are on the wrong paradigm, that you're going to have to become an environmental doctor if you're really going to help mankind achieve our maximum intended useful lifespan. And since intravenous chelation, as great as it is, and I love it, because after all, after the AIDS treatment, I thought I'd become Superman, I can't do that for the whole world, and yet the problem is for the world. So the data then becomes, what are the facts? Well, the facts are that calcium EDTA, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, given once a month, which is pretty convenient and painless and takes 5 minutes, actually provably prevents diabetics from ever winding up on dialysis. So now I've got moved from diasodium EDTA, which is what I wrote the protocol for, that have treated millions of people that we studied with the TACT trial, the trial to assess chelation therapy. Anybody can study it. But now I moved to calcium EDTA because we have proof that even people who never worked with lead, but they're diabetic, if you give them a shot a month, which takes 5 minutes, they never wind up on dialysis. So that alone would change a lot of healthcare. But that now makes it possible to go back and read the research on calcium EDTA, which was used by all directors of any company that worked with lead. If you were with a lead battery factory, a lead paint, how could you keep the workers without really running into trouble? They all gave them oral tablets of EDTA, which was documented in 507 published papers. The abstracts of those papers are on my website, GordonResearch.com. So anybody taking the time to look at the actual abstracts will have no question but that oral EDTA is both safe and effective and really is wonderful effect on lead as well as a weak effect on cadmium and other toxic metals, and that it works even though it's only 5 to 13% absorbed because it's convenient, it's not much more expensive than taking vitamin C, and because I've researched over those years in order to bring chelation to the world, I have actually paid for over 7,000 papers to be copied in libraries and have read them. So I have seen proof that, for example, you can dip a multicellular organism in EDTA and it lives 50% longer if you dip it every day. So I look at this as being one reason that I, at age 79, am now enjoying the highest health I've had in my lifetime, because on a background, I have over 30 years not gone a single day without taking oral EDTA, but my colleagues have poo-pooed the idea as being useless because they say it's so poorly absorbed. But the problem is this: women become hypertensive around menopause because of the more rapid breakdown and turnover of your bone. The more rapidly they break down, the more rapidly they kill you. In other words, in your body, you have a major lead canal. You have a source of poisoning in your bones, and you must keep those bones really strong. And if we don't exercise, and if we get off this nonsense that estrogen is so dangerous, we have to do everything. Vitamin K2, we have to keep our bones from breaking down, because when they break down, they are releasing lead, and that's on top of the lead that's in our water, food, and air. So now we have a double source of poisoning us, and it turns out that if you just gently perturb that by having in your GI tract at all times a little bit of EDTA, you can provably have nice effects, because you're not only going to catch the lead that came in the water and the food that you ate, but you're also going to help capture the lead that the bones will turn over. It takes an average of 15 years, but we do know that intravenous chelation does not perturb the level of lead in your bones. So I can take a welder, give him 100 IV chelation, get his provoked urine lead down to very safe levels. He tells me how great he feels, but I know that unless I keep him on chelation the rest of his life, he has not moved the lead out of his bone. And as his bone remodels slowly over the next 15 years, he will again repoison. And actually, when I had the laboratory mineral lab, we found that within 6 months of stopping chelation, a person working with lead would have almost the same provoked urine lead level that he had before you gave him the 100 chelation, because the bones can't be loaded with lead and have no lead in the soft tissues, so it relocates. And this is all well documented in the literature. So we have to take the attitude that the trial to assess chelation therapy proved that we have a powerful therapy that can dramatically change how long you live. And we actually have Weisskopf at Harvard is the one that did the best studies on thousands of people, showing the adverse effect on cognitive function tied tightly to exactly how high the level of lead is in your bones. So we have data. And the data is sort of persuasive, but we can't afford to put everybody into intravenous chelation, as great as it is. And I wish everybody could get once a month, because that is clearly 100% absorbed, but it isn't essential for the benefit, although the data is clear that if you did the IV once a month, dialysis centers could be largely closed down in this country, because the kidney can't handle all this lead and cadmium. And so when I got into this field, they tried to tell me that chelation was going to kill people because it was going to damage their kidneys. And now we have the exact proof that that's a complete 180 degrees off. It will save the kidneys of this country. So it's a big story. And as we move into oral EDTA, the oral EDTA clearly then is a safe way of having something in your intestinal tract at all times. But now I've moved on into adding things like zeolite and high-dose fiber and stabilized rice bran and greens. We have to have our greens, and I take 8 grams of vitamin C every day, a teaspoon twice a day, because I know how toxic our environment is. And since I became knowledgeable that we can prove that lead has all these adverse effects, we do know that the average child that is born is actually got twice the level of lead and mercury the mother had, because the wisdom of nature is that the mother's life is more important and the child is a trash can for toxins. And that was published in the National Geographic when we first started measuring the levels of chemicals in our blood. And we now know with the 10 American study that every child is born with tremendous bad things. But the Lancet Neurology published a paper this last month about the epidemic of neurodevelopment disorders, and they tie it right at lead, mercury, arsenic, toluene, and PCBs. And so we're not just talking anymore about the fact that you can find these things in anybody measured. We now have consensus developing that these things, as Dr. Jeffrey Bland has so well shown when he started really explaining to people what all of these toxins are doing and how it's tying to the increase in diabetes. So the more we move the world into consciousness that we have poisoned our planet, the better we can do of having a responsible approach that's affordable and safe, that can be taken. And as I said, Dr. Johan Björksten proved that EDTA was basically a life-extending treatment, in that rotifers, why would they live 50% longer by dipping them in every day? If you use EGTA, they even live a little longer. So we have something that's safe, that's dealing with something that has a major direction on how long we get to live and function, and now we can perturb that, but then that opens the door for what are the other toxins you want to deal with. And simply put, I mean, if we realize that we're not going to stop burning coal in the foreseeable future, and we're all going to be very afraid every time we eat a fish from the ocean, because what goes up has to come down, but that's coming down in our air. We can prove that just living in the west coast of America, 30% of the total body mercury in your body is from the burning of coal in China. So obviously, the more I add to the EDTA trick, the longer you're going to live. But the EDTA trick is one that is really hitting a narrow target. And if we can get, as Dr. Gervasio Lamas plans, with the data being so persuasive from the $31 million trial to assess chelation therapy, he is definitely meeting with the authorities at the highest level to plan the next multi-million-dollar study, because now, in spite of all the rocks thrown at the chelation movement, you have to understand that the enemies of chelation are so powerful that even when we were the 5th year of the ongoing trial, they still were suing to tell us we had to stop the trial because we're wasting the public money. So they're very upset when you move the paradigm from the cholesterol one over to one that has real legs, and getting lead out of people has real legs.
Wow, very eloquently stated. Thank you for detailing us on so many different aspects. And I have a number of questions based on what you said, especially the last point. Dr. Gordon, you and Dr. Bland have really been the forerunners in this whole area of detoxification. And, you know, both of you, excellent training. Jeffrey Bland with a PhD, you with multiple medical degrees. Why is it, despite the fact that there is some science out there, that there is such a pushback? And why is it that we don't see the plethora of research studies out there? You did name a number of different ones, but why don't we have full acceptance? Do you think that is a political aspect in relation to whether it's pharmaceutical companies, food companies, you know, because you even mentioned that there are enemies of chelation out there. So I'm just wondering if you can help us to understand this a little bit, because that's part of the reason why we're doing this Detox Summit, is to increase the visibility and the credibility. But we have to understand What are the barriers to making this credible?
I'm so glad you asked that question because as Dr. Gervasio Lamas pointed out, he had a dramatic slide. He had a picture of horses coming at you at wild speed and another picture of horses going away and not even wanting to talk to you. He said, if this was now patentable, you wouldn't be able to drive the pharmaceutical companies away. Overnight, every door would be opened to you. But since it's totally affordable and there's no potential sudden richness, he said they've done everything they can in case the Mayo Clinic, for example, says, we're not going to change one thing. We're going to keep on doing the bypass and the stent. So here, in spite of data that is so powerful that when you take the time to look at it, it's criminal to actually ignore this and not change your practice of medicine. But there's everybody making money on the existing system. And as Dr. Lamas points out, if there was something patentable in what I've just said, we would be the darlings of the country. But as you can see, only Forbes magazine even published anything positive from the trial to assess chelation therapy. And remember, this study was set up because they hoped it would be the end of the chelation movement. I had to force the government into a position they had to do this study because we'd already chelated successfully over 1 million people, and we had very powerful people that were pressuring their congressmen to say, why isn't this being done? And so it takes public pressure. And at this point in time, even though the data for diabetics is so overwhelming that we will get another 10, 20, 30, 40 million bucks, but this time we have to add to it something to tie it into what we now believe is the operant mechanism. Because when I started the chelation all those years ago, we thought we were cleaning arteries, and I have pictures that I absolutely can prove that pathologically calcified kidneys or arm or aortas can lower the level of calcium, which is beneficial, but that's expensive and time-consuming. Now we know the real mechanism is the de-leading, and if we can wake up the world to this direction, then there will be other substances. For example, iron overload is even another big market, and yet we have lots of people just giving blood, but we have iron chelators that are safe and effective that I couldn't even interest the drug companies into something that would help deal with iron overload because they consider chelation to be such a dirty word. And clearly the fact that there were so many people trying to stop the trials of chelation, which is quite interesting because remember, this study was agreed to by our enemies and our supporters, and the enemies certainly dreamed that it was going to be the end of this chelation and their patients wouldn't be asking about chelation anymore. They dreamed that this was going to kill the chelation, and they can't yet accept the fact that it came back with such powerful data that it makes any drug treatment they're prescribing it makes what they're prescribing look like it is not giving patients first-class care.
So how do we, as the listeners, listening to your advocacy and really inspiring us, how do we set down this path of being empowered with our own health? And how do we find what you referred to as an environmental doctor? How do we find somebody that does this form of chelation that you're speaking to, this oral chelation? And, how do we start down the path? How do we make it real?
Well, it's a great question because, listen, here we have the government paying $31 million for a study that's published in JAMA, and yet my product, which I developed called Beyond Chelation Improved, which has 9 pills in it, we spent $10 million in the 1960s seeing how to stop all heart attacks with the oral because we went way beyond oral EDTA. We added the omega-3. We added a useful mucopolysaccharide that the body thinks is heparin, so my patients don't die of clots. I get them off cumin. So here we have actually solid thing, but the government absolutely made me take the word chelation. Beyond Chelation Improved was 9 pills in a packet that had $10 million worth of research and 3 textbooks, and they made me take the word chelation, or they would not allow eBay or Amazon to carry the product. So I've changed the name to Binding Cellular Impurities because we are dealing with such a complicated thing, and it's really complicated in that we have autistic kids, and we know there's lead in those children. They're going to be healthy if the lead gets out. But because they have a defect in the epigenetic changes, they often don't even express. The hair is an excretion of your body like urine. So if there's no lead in your hair, it's staying in your body. It's not going out. And so now, but the enemy sits there and say, oh, this child has no lead. Look, there's no lead in the blood or the urine or the hair. Well, that doesn't mean it's not in the poor child's brain. There's an excretion defect and they can't get rid of it. So now you're in the awkward position that only Harvard has this unique ionizable source of lead that allows you to, as conveniently as bone density studies done, do lead density. And without that study, all the poor public can do is become knowledgeable about everything that I've said, do their own research, because when you get a complete paradigm change. If I had said 40 years ago when I started to bring chelation to the world that lead was the problem, they would have locked me up like Semmelweis. And now that you've actually got the American Heart Association publishing articles, lead unmasked as silent killer, and Weisskopf saying it's the most powerful risk factor they've ever seen in the study of medicine, it makes chasing and lowering cholesterol an act of quackery. Because if you could only choose to do one thing, would you lower cholesterol? Would you lower lead? There's no question. There's never been any cholesterol, because most of us know the cholesterol theory is a joke anyhow. But now you can help the diabetic, you can help fellow men, but you're going to have the poor public realize that not everybody can go to Harvard and say, I would like my child's kneecap, his patella checked for lead level, because obviously there's not that much space in a $500,000 kind of device. But we will move into new levels of protoporphyrin. We'll move into directions so that, because the public deserves to have some before and after measurement. They say, I'm not wasting my money. And obviously that is a really hard conundrum, because if I was in charge of, if they made me the Surgeon General, in addition to stopping smoking and starting exercise, I would put EDTA into the water supply. But obviously it's because I know the benefit and the risk. Let's look at it. EDTA, ethylene diamine tetraacetic. Tetra, 4, acetic. Acetic is what? Vinegar. So I'm a grocer. I'm selling you vinegar. But the point is that the EDTA, if you decide to be taking it every day of your life, everybody thought, oh my gosh, you're going to lose all the zinc, you're going to lose all the trace, you're going to wind up a blob. Well, I've had 1,000 milligrams minimum in all my patients for years, and I often take 2,000 and 3,000, but I wound up putting it in a package that has a multiple vitamin mineral supplement with all the trace elements of the Great Salt Lake, so that we put in cesium and rubin in the gold and the silver. So yes, it is a slightly complicated pattern in that chelators are non-specific. They don't just magically say, there's the lead. They like the lead first, but if there's no more lead in the body, it'll settle for mercury, but finally it'll have to settle for taking out your zinc, and so you would have to be on a multiple all the time. So the complexity of how to educate the public, since the ideal test, which is bone lead, is not going to be widely available, we will be looking for other tests like protoporphyrins or nagalase. There may be other tests that will develop that will help people look at before and after measurements. You see, the popularization of chelation was really done through thermography, because with a picture of a heat-sensing camera, the cameras cost $10,000 to $50,000, and we just take a picture from across the room, and if your left forehead is colder than your right forehead, there's a block in the arteries to the left side of your brain, and that's called stroke risk. And rather than see a surgeon, we just give you chelation, and it completely gets back to being warm. So we can do thermography if you're interested in blood flow. But blood flow is way down on the list, because I'm interested in the IQ of our nation. And therefore, since Weisskopf at Harvard is the most powerful study ever done is by Harvard. And it was about the lead and the effect on cognitive function. So obviously, I need something that wakes people up to the fact that, like the 10 American study, which was paid for by the Environment Working Group, EWG.org, allows anybody to see what is the average level of polybrominated diphenyl ether and bisphenol A and dioxin and PCB and lead mercury that's in every child that's born, because it's off the scale, the neurotoxins and the endocrine disruptors and the carcinogens. And it was nice that Lancet Neurology, February this year, published the paper that the epidemic of neurodevelopment disorders is tied to the lead, mercury, cadmium, to lead, mercury, arsenic. And so now you can wake people up and say, okay, can we preventively spend some money, because until the government says people can't have food, they've allowed EDTA to be sold. It is used to keep food fresh because it cuts down free radicals in food. So if one spends any time looking on my website to the 507 published papers, one would wind up buying EDTA. Now, the government has really not protected the chelation movement, because some of the suppliers of EDTA have really gone out of business, and not all EDTAs are treated alike. And so in order to I actually have people bathing in EDTA. I love EDTA any way you can do it. So I bathe people in EDTA and zeolite, and autistic children start to improve immediately because the skin is an organ of excretion. So we're at the point that if we get the knowledge in the average person's mind that we are living on a poisoned planet, and that these toxins are adversely affecting all aspects, not only how long we get to live, but how well we live. In other words, how well is our brain functioning. And when we put that in the picture, then it will become part of the cost of being alive if we're going to have to coexist with people that are allowed to put coal into the air. We're going to have to understand that it's going to be our responsibility, that no one else has the responsibility. It's not the government's job to come out and give you a packet of EDTA and say, here, take this every day the rest of your life. It's going to be your job to learn what can we do and become more active in helping cut down. And so the burning of coal is, everybody's afraid, obviously for good reason, of nuclear energy, but one way or another, people were going to have their energy. So these are complex issues that until you know the real price you're paying for burning coal, it might be that you would rather take a chance that occasionally there's a nuclear mishap. I mean, we don't have easy answers yet. I'm sure there will be better answers coming.
Well, and I hope so. Again, I really like the fact that you've been such a champion for this whole movement of detoxification, and particularly with EDTA. You've already mentioned a number of chronic conditions and issues whereby we might see a use for EDTA. So neurodevelopmental issues, of course, cardiovascular, which is why we've had Dr. Mark Houston, Dr. Joel Kahn speaking on behalf of the Detox Summit, and then also diabetes, autism. For the average listener, what are some other conditions that you see? Are you really seeing that toxicity is linked to all chronic diseases, or is there really this concentration of certain types of chronic disease that we see that connection with?
Well, that's a great question, because obviously on 1,700 people with the $31 million study, we are able to tease out this dramatic effect on diabetes. But when we look at the big picture in my clinical practice, I have had such dramatic success with any condition. And until you think it through, if you look at the words in the Archives of Internal Medicine, it says all causes of morbidity and mortality are tied to how low you keep your lead throughout your life. Now think about that. Does that mean suicide is tied to lead? Absolutely. Does that mean that you die in an auto accident was tied to lead? Absolutely. Because your reflexes were ever. So only the people that really take the time to tease out the data I recognize that I have developed my Fight for Your Health program in the acronym Fight for Your Health. The F is for food and focus, I for infection, G for genetics, H for heavy metals, and H for hormone, and T for toxin. So in other words, what I try to do is protect the public so they don't blame everything on Lyme, or they don't blame everything on a mean mother-in-law. They start to really broaden their focus and realize that optimal health is, you live in a country in which we amazingly restore 1930 Chevys and 1930 Mercedes to like new condition. How do they do that? That's called taillight to bumper. You don't just sell them seat covers, a new tire, a new motor, or new sign. You do everything, and that's what I am teaching my clients I have to do for you to, at age 79, be the healthiest you've been in your life. You will have to have been doing everything, and that's the sad truth, but at the same time it's exciting. Because if I feel this good at 79, having at 29 had to close my medical practice because I couldn't walk from room to room and wound up in medical school unable to go up a flight of steps without going into heart failure, I'm pretty optimistic that we're onto a basic picture. But as I stated, I'm trying to not let everybody, I use lead as a whipping boy because we have the data. I mean, clearly, if you look at bisphenol A and if you look at all the dioxins and the PCBs and the rest of the thing, you can make an equally powerful case. And it turns out that they are more expensive, as Dr. Philip Landrigan, who's the co-author of the new paper in Lancet Neurology. Now, Philip Landrigan is a pediatrician at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. What is his background to be able to state these neurodevelopment disorders, which include autism and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and obsessive compulsive? There isn't a condition that you can name that I can't improve with my FIGHT acronym, food, infection, genetics, heavy metal, hormone, toxin. But at the top of the list, there's a relative risk. In other words, if I'm on the wrong death, if I should have been born with a label that says I was born to be a vegetarian and I'm dumb enough to be eating the wrong diet for my body, that is still not got as persuasive an effect on what my health is going to be as this lead story. So as we look at all risk factors to try to figure out what are we going to do to enjoy high health so we can do what we're meant to do while we're on the earth, this lead is an easy focus to broaden your understanding. But once you're there, then you throw in the word mercury, and then you throw in cadmium, arsenic, and then all of a sudden you're going to be aware that how much arsenic in the chicken were, and then you start to really broaden your perspective as to how, without daily detoxification, and because I have developed what I call a power drink, where I use all the greens from on land and the ocean, so that I'm not into just spirulina, and I'm not just into broccoli, I'm into everything. And then I use maca, which turns out to be like a glucosinolate and has many activities. Then I use, as I said, never less than 4,000 milligrams of vitamin C twice a day. We developed one that doesn't give diarrhea and so on. But the thing is, what I really wanted to be clear about is that when I came into the zeolite story, it looked as though the good Lord was looking out for us, because they give us here a volcanic rock that under a microscope looks like a sponge, and you have in that volcanic rock, you have little tiny cavities that are the exact size of an atom of lead or mercury, and here it's even more effective than most mercury chelators because it grabs the single atom of lead or mercury and it's got the charge and it keeps it safely there and it carries it all the way out of your body, so that sometimes the oral chelator like DMSA doesn't do that. It can disassociate. So it's always important to recognize a concept called enterohepatic reuptake. In other words, if I take the mercury from my right eye and I catch it with DMSA and it goes through the liver and it's developed and it's dumped into my intestine, once it's there, if I don't have in my intestine some zeolite, some EDTA, some other things, that DMSA mercury complex can disassociate and go 2 feet further and be reabsorbed, and now the mercury was in your right eye is returned to your left eye. So it's very important to always think about the intestine and the emptying. So I got very much into the stabilized rice bran because actually it's loaded with stuff like what we would call beta-cytosol, as well as octocosanol, gamma-rhizanol, all the B vitamins. So I use a lot of that, and then that helps support the necessary fiber, both soluble and insoluble, so I can support a more healthy intestine. So not everybody has to have a fecal transplant. I have to have something in your intestine so that the right probiotics have something there. So it's also multifactorial. If we started measuring more people with things like circulating immune complexes, we'd find more and more people, actually the leaky gut is winding up with the undigested food particle that is only the amino acid is safe. When it's still a dipeptide, it's too big and the body reacts to it. So there's such a comprehensive program that fortunately Dr. Jeffrey Bland has done such a wonderful job, and the Institute for Functional Medicine has been bringing on many doctors who otherwise just weren't interested in this whole picture. And I'm so happy the way things are going. More and more doctors are waking up to the entire complexity, because environmental medicine really has to be part of advanced medicine and figure out which food the person is reacting to and find out what infection, because today we have provably finding so many infections in people. According to Harvard, according to their testing, almost 95% of people properly tested show positive for cytomegalic virus, which is growing in your plaque and your arteries. So it makes everything multifactorial, but EDTA can even have antiviral activities. And so it's interesting when you put the ball of wax together, the benefit-risk ratio of what you're going to take every day of your life, what's affordable, and what are the benefits and the risks are things that as more and more groups gain more and more credibility and make broad suggestions to the public that, as I said, since we don't have a perfect test to measure your bone lead unless you go to Harvard, we need to take some general steps based on what we know from the California Institute of Technology. Nobody did as much work as Claire Patterson to actually go to the Arctic and the Antarctic and drill down and stick up that core of ice and figure out when did we finally poison the earth and how. And it was, what was happening with the leaded gas story was so huge. I actually was part of the study with our laboratory, Mineral Lab. We actually worked with the University of Maryland to develop the data that we showed to the chairman of Exxon, and he said, effective today, he said, I'm the father of 5 children, we're taking lead out of our gas. He did that based on the study that we were participating with the University of Maryland to get that kind of data so that responsible corporate decisions were made. If we hadn't done that, our future was really bleak because the leaded gas was poisoning the earth so rapidly.
Dr. Gordon, thank you so much for sharing with us this wealth of information that you bring and really detailing us a bit more about lead. We haven't had this type of formalized expertise at this point in the summit yet, so this has been just phenomenal. I can't even tell you. And for the listeners, I want to repeat again that Dr. Gordon is co-founder of the American College for the Advancement in Medicine. And if you're interested, one of the things that I'm signed up for is Dr. Gordon's online FACT group. And FACT is an acronym that stands for Forum on Anti-Aging and Chelation Therapies. And what you see are all types of discussions, conversations as it relates to the area of chelation, but also I think medicine in general. It's really fabulous. Dr. Gordon, if people want to contact you, what would be the best way to do that?
I like them to call 1-800-580-PLUS or 1-800-580-7587. And I need them to know that on my website, every lecture that I give, including one 4 weeks ago on the end of cancer, 3 weeks ago on the end of heart disease, 2 weeks ago on the end of brain disease, last week on advanced detoxification, those webinars with the latest research are in the PowerPoints and they're downloadable. Anyone interested just goes to gordonresearch.com, clicks on the word media/webinar, and select the webinar you're interested in, because some people are much more worried about cancer and other people are more worried about heart, and a lot of us today are worried about that brain. And so we have amazing new developments that, because I have, not at the current time, almost 4,000 members in 65 countries, they keep on making me look like I'm smart because they send me things that nobody else hears about, and I continue to send that out when I send out 3 emails just to let people know there are new things happening every day. And it's an exciting time to be alive because the new medicine is going to let us achieve the 120 plus years of healthy living we were meant to have.
Well, thank you again for all of your contributions to this field. It truly has been an honor to interview you and a privilege to have you as part of this Detox Summit. So thank you very much.